quantitative research and qualitative research. I'll start by showing you two questions. One is quantitative, the other is qualitative. The quantitative question asks, are you feeling well? While the qualitative research question asks, how are you feeling? Now, over the course of this presentation, this is going to make more sense, but just understand that even though these are essentially asking the same thing, they are markedly different, and one is specifically quantitative, the other is clearly qualitative. Let's talk about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is objective, whereas qualitative research is subjective. Quantitative research involves deductive reasoning. It's where you test a hypothesis by beginning your study with a hypothesis. Qualitative research involves inductive reasoning, and it forms a hypothesis, which means at the end of your study you conclude with a hypothesis in qualitative research. Quantitative research involves theoretically closed-ended questions, therefore it takes a shorter time to conduct. Qualitative research involves theoretically open-ended questions, and therefore it takes a longer period of time to conduct. In quantitative research, you have an emphasis on generalizable findings that can be numerically measured. There's an aim to fit data into a box. It's either this or that. Whereas in qualitative research, there's an emphasis on specified findings that cannot be numerically measured. It aims to fit data outside of a box, sort of like saying it's neither this nor that, rather something unique completely. And quantitative research involves a sample of larger numbers of research subjects, whereas qualitative research involves a sample of a smaller number of research participants. The keywords also here being not just larger and smaller, but the names given to the sample. In quantitative research, the people you are collecting data from are called research subjects, whereas in qualitative research, the people you're collecting data from are called research participants. That being said, there are plenty of similarities between quantitative and qualitative research. First, you can't have one without the other. One forms hypotheses, qualitative research. The other tests hypotheses, quantitative research. So clearly one is the foundation for the other. You cannot have one without the other. Both involve comprehensive sampling techniques. Both are appropriate for the study of any topic in any setting at any time. Both focus on connecting ongoing research with existing literature, and both produce new information. So given what we know about the differences and similarities between quantitative and qualitative research, you see now why one question is quantitative while the other is qualitative. You see the question on the left, are you feeling well? It's a yes or no question. Even though I'm not asking, are you feeling well, yes or no, it's essentially a yes or no question. Whereas in the qualitative version, it asks, how are you feeling? Which is not a yes or no question. It can be good, it can be great, it could be not so good. You could say something like, well, I'm glad you asked. Sit down, let's have a conversation. So qualitative research can take a longer period of time to conduct. There's a greater deal of nuance in qualitative research, whereas in quantitative research, we're trying to generalize, we're trying to understand, do you fit into this box, yes box, or the no box when it comes to the question of are you feeling well? Now, within quantitative research, there are three major umbrellas under which other designs fall. So the first umbrella is pre-experimental, the second umbrella is quasi-experimental, the third umbrella is experimental. Before we go into the individual research designs, let's talk about the umbrellas. So within quantitative research designs, you want to look for two things to determine whether or not your study is going to be pre-experimental, quasi-experimental, or experimental. First, is there going to be random assignment? Can you tell a particular person or a group of people to be in one group or another group, the experimental group or the control group? Can you do that? Is there random assignment there available to the researcher, to you, the researcher? The second is whether or not there is a control group, or if there are multiple observations. So in pre-experimental research design, you don't have random assignment. You also don't have a control group or multiple observations. In quasi-experimental designs, you don't have random assignment, but you do have either a control group or multiple observations. You may even have both. And in experimental designs, under that particular umbrella, you have both random assignment and you have control groups and or multiple observations. So within, or I should say under the pre-experimental design umbrella, remember that sample question of are you feeling well? That is a quantitative question because it's a yes or no question. O here stands for observation, X stands for intervention, and the intervention here is smiling while asking this question. So in one group post-test only, within that particular design, we have the intervention first, which means that the researcher will smile, right? That's the intervention, will smile and then ask the question while observing the sample. And the question is, are you feeling well? And the answer will likely be either yes or no, right? So you have the intervention of the researcher smiling and then the observation while they're smiling, asking the question, are you feeling well? That's a one group post-test only design. The post-test only with non-equivalent groups design involves two groups. The first being a group that is getting the intervention, meaning that the researcher is smiling at them and asking them, are you feeling well? And then observing the answers. The next group, the researcher is asking them, are you feeling well? But they're not smiling. The researcher is not smiling at that particular group, right? That is the post-test only with non-equivalent groups design. The one group pre-test, post-test design involves the researcher first asking the question, are you feeling well, without smiling, and then smiling and asking the same question again, right? Now this might be done like immediately or the next day, but essentially it's a one group pre-test, post-test design in that you're asking the question, pre-test, right? Are you feeling well? Then you're intervening with a smile and then asking the same question again. Are you feeling well? These are three examples of quantitative research designs under the pre-experimental umbrella. Remember, the pre-experimental research design involves no random assignment and no control groups or multiple observations. Quasi-experimental does not involve random assignment, but it does involve either control groups or multiple observations, and that's what we'll talk about now. Quasi-experimental designs, again, the sample question is, are you feeling well? O stands for observation, X stands for the intervention, which is just a smile. In the non-equivalent control groups design, you have the observation prior, in that you're asking the question, are you feeling well? You have two groups, right? The first group, you're asking the question, are you feeling well? Not smiling. The second group, you're also asking, are you feeling well? Also not smiling. Then, with one of the groups, this being called the experimental group, you're smiling at that group and asking, are you feeling well? But with the second group, you ask the same question again without smiling. So essentially, for the first group, you're not smiling, are you feeling well? Then you're smiling, are you feeling well? Right? That's the first group. The second group, are you feeling well? Not smiling. And then again, not smiling, are you feeling well? That's a non-equivalent control group design. The time series design is where you're taking multiple observations both prior to and after the intervention has been implemented. So in this particular example, you're asking, let's say, three days back to back to back. Are you feeling well? Not smiling. Are you feeling well? Not smiling. Are you feeling well? Not smiling. Still just collecting data and observing. Then the next 3 days thereafter, you're smiling and asking, are you feeling well? Are you feeling well? Are you feeling well? And the idea is that maybe the answers will change, maybe the answers won't. Depends on what your hypothesis is that you're testing, right? And then finally, the multiple time series design involves two groups, one being the control group, the other being the experimental group. And you're doing something similar to the time series design in that you're collecting data before an intervention is in place and after an intervention is in place, but you also have the added benefit of a control group where you have a group that is being asked the question, are you feeling well? Are you feeling well? Are you feeling well? Both groups first starting with no intervention, but only one group getting the intervention of being smiled at after the first three observations are seen. So the first group will be asked, are you feeling well 3 days in a row without being smiled at? And then 3 days in a row, are you feeling well while being smiled at? The second group will be asked, are you feeling well for 3 days without being smiled at? And then the next 3 days, again, are you feeling well without being smiled at? Once again, remember that quasi-experimental research involves no random assignment of participants, or research subjects, I should say, but it does involve either a control group or multiple observations, as you've already seen. Experimental research designs, which sometimes they're called true experimental designs, they involve both random assignment and control groups or multiple observations, and we'll talk about those now. The sample question here again being, are you feeling well? O stands for observation, X stands for intervention, which is that smile of yours, and R here stands for random assignment, right? So in classic experimental design, you first randomly assign people to this particular experiment, right? And then you ask that question. Now, the R makes all the difference. The random assignment makes all the difference when it comes to whether or not a study is experimental or pre-experimental or maybe even quasi-experimental. If there's random assignment, then and of course a control group or multiple observations, then you have an experimental design. So here there's random assignment first, then the group is asked, are you feeling well without being smiled at, and then asked, are you feeling well while being smiled at. Then next, in the post-test only control groups design, you've got random assignment into two different groups, one being the experimental group, the other being the control group. In the first group, you're being smiled at and asked, are you feeling well? And then the second group, the control group, you're being asked, are you feeling well without being smiled at? The Solomon four-group design involves four groups, as you can see, right, as the title says, or as the name of it says. All four are randomly assigned, so there's random assignment into, let's say you've got 100 participants, 100 research subjects, and the subjects are 25, 25, 25, 25, just randomly assigned to one of the four groups within the Solomon four-group design. The first of four groups will all of them are getting randomly assigned, obviously. The first group will be asked, are you feeling well without being smiled at? And then they'll also be asked, are you feeling well while being smiled at? The second group, randomly assigned, will be asked, are you feeling well without being smiled at? And then again, they'll be asked, are you feeling well without being smiled at? The third group, randomly assigned, will not be observed prior, so they will not be asked, are you feeling well without being smiled at even once. Instead, the one time that they will be asked, are you feeling well, it will be while they are being smiled at by you, the researcher. And then finally, the fourth group is a group that will also have just one observation. They will be asked, are you feeling well? This group will not be smiled at, and only one, they will be observed only once. Okay? Once again, remember that quantitative research, closed-ended questions, are you feeling well? That is indeed a quantitative question. And now that we've finished covering quantitative questions, let's go into qualitative questions, which is asked as, how are you feeling? Now, within qualitative research, I'm going to cover four different kinds of qualitative research designs here: ethnography, life history, focus groups, and grounded theory. So first, in the qualitative research category, you've got ethnography. Ethnography studies how people within a particular culture live and interpret the world around them. So the sample question here being, how are you feeling? You're really trying to understand whether or not people in a particular culture, maybe people in a particular neighborhood, people of a particular age group, or ethnic background perhaps. If they are, let's say, more modest when they're answering their questions, or other groups might be more positive versus more negative. It's just in the context of culture that ethnography is that particular research design, qualitative research design, is conducted. So life history is very similar to ethnography in that it studies how people interpret events and meanings in their own lives. Seems very similar, but instead of there being any kind of cultural connotation, it's just that individual's own life, or that group of individuals' own lives. So again, the sample question being, how are you feeling? You're not trying to put the answers to this question by the group that you're studying or the groups that you're studying into any kind of cultural context like you would with ethnography. Rather, you're just trying to understand that the people that you're asking these questions to, their individuality, their uniqueness, and how how they interpret events and meanings in their own lives, without cultural context being a prerequisite. Focus groups study guided discussions on specific topics. So an example of this would be, again, using the same sample question. If I were to gather, let's say, 8 people together, and I were to ask them to ask each of the other 7 people, how are you feeling? And then wherever the conversation goes, you might end up having a 2 or 3 hour conversation about, why do people ask this question? What do they really mean it when they ask, how are you feeling? Is it more of a saying hello type, or do people really want to know the answer? So you see how, like, you push one little domino and you can end up having so many different conversations that stem from that simple question of how are you feeling. You've got 8 people in the room. One person asks the other 7 people, and then you just go round robin, and you have a long conversation thereafter, and you study the interactions, you study the discussions that happen based on this particular topic. Grounded theory studies themes with the purpose of deriving theories for future analysis. Here the sample question is, again, how are you feeling? Now here you're really looking closely at how people are answering, because your goal is to derive theories for future analysis. So essentially, let's say if people who answer positively smile while they're answering the question, you ask the question, how are you feeling? And while they're answering, if it's a positive answer, they smile. And if it's a negative answer, they don't smile while answering that question. Then your theory that you might derive from the data that you've gathered, the qualitative data that you've gathered, might be that smiling correlates with people feeling well. So people who feel well tend to smile while they're answering, and people who don't feel well tend not to smile while they're answering. So this theory that you're deriving for future analysis, we'll call that the hypothesis. Remember, qualitative research is hypothesis formulation, and here you formed a hypothesis which then you can later study using quantitative research, which brings us back to this slide. You see how quantitative research and qualitative research are 2 sides of the same coin, really. You cannot have one without the other. Both of these questions, even though they seem similar, they're different enough where one is necessary to formulate the other, right? You have to have the how are you feeling question in order to be able to formulate an intervention that relates to are you feeling well, and how you can have people answering that question positively or negatively depending on whatever intervention you think you may have discovered using qualitative research. So one is inductive qualitative research, you're building an understanding, and then quantitative research is deductive, where you're trying to take away all of the extraneous variables and trying to understand a concept and understand a topic to its fullest. I want to speak briefly on mixed methods designs. Mixed methods designs are any combination of quantitative and qualitative designs. Theoretically, these studies fill the gaps left behind by studies that are exclusively quantitative or exclusively qualitative, but they can take a much longer period of time to conduct, and you might need more resources than are available to you to get this kind of research study done. So mixed methods research designs are good in that, they involve both the qualitative strengths and the quantitative strengths, but they also involve some of the weaknesses, right? So qualitative research, as we know, takes a lot of time. Quantitative research doesn't, so like you're going to be adding time to a partially quantitative research study. Qualitative research is also not concerned with putting the answers and the concepts and the data that's derived into a particular box. Quantitative research does. So you have to sort of compromise between the two while you're doing a mixed method study. So there are some benefits and drawbacks to mixed methods studies as well. Thank you very much.